Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. A common trope in studies of digital technology and the internet is that they grew at least partly out of countercultural movements of smelly hippies who dreamed of better tomorrows. Two classics, John Markoff's What the Dormouse Said and Fred Turner's From Counterculture to Cyberculture, are ground zero for this narrative, probably. But you see it in so many places today. I even saw a recent piece of media that went further and argued that some hippies envisioned a computer system that would have had revolutionary consequences for our society. But their radical dreams were crushed by the military-industrial complex and corporate power. Who'd have thunk it? The military-industrial complex and corporate power. Now, I'm not saying this narrative is completely wrong. There's clearly something to it, but I do think we should wonder about the balance of such stories. I mean, first off, as someone born near the Gen X millennial cusp, it is basically my birthright and duty to question any story that glorifies boomers. I mean, my God. Fucking boomers. Second, I think part of the problem here is how academics and other writers, who social surveys make clear are themselves mostly a bunch of big ol' self-righteous libs just like myself, like writing about left-leaning movements that are not representative of the mainstream of society and often didn't have that big of an impact on events. There's a big attraction there, which you could easily think of as a form of bias. It can put our historical perspective out of whack. But there's a third issue of balance too, and it goes like this. What about all the engineers, business people, and others who shaped our modern systems who were not countercultural? What about all of those people that Richard Nixon called the silent majority? What about all of the basic bitches of the world? What about all of the normies with their deeply and passionately felt normcore ways? What about the squares? That's the question Cyrus Mody, professor in the history of science, technology, and innovation, and director of the STS Program at Maastricht University, asks in his recent book, The Squares, U.S. Physical and Engineering Scientists in the Long 1970s, which examines how non-activist scientists and engineers adapted their work to a rapidly changing social and political landscape during that period. One of the things I really like about Cyrus's work is that he has written about a core set of characters since his doctoral work, yet he has found ways to use these historical actors that he knows so well to answer a number of different theoretical and historical questions over the course of his several projects. I talked to him about that and how he came to write about square scientists, including by asking whether he deeply identifies with them. Another thing I like about Cyrus's book is that it raises big questions about movements to have scientists and engineers practice what has variously been called social responsibility and responsible innovation and so on and so forth. There have been many such calls to make STEM workers more moral in recent decades, right up to today, including by pushing to build ever greater amounts of ethics into STEM education curricula. Such calls have always struck me as deeply naive and anti-social scientific in that they fail to account for social structures in society or to understand how cultures have successfully regulated problematic aspects of technology in the past. The calls arise from a kind of uncritical, tepid, milquetoast liberalism that no one should take very seriously, it seems to me. What Cyrus finds is, just as you would expect, his square scientists and engineers engaged in so-called social responsibility when social structures incentivize them to do so, and stopped when those incentives disappeared. I mean, can you believe it? Put that in your hippie pipes and smoke it, all you anticipatory governance rubes out there. My God. Cyrus is someone I respect a lot. He's a prolific and serious scholar who is always on to fascinating things. I had a great time talking to my square as all get out colleague, Cyrus. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hey, get excited! Cyrus, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Lee.
So The Squares is a neat book. If you were going to tell a stranger about what it's about, what do you say? What were you trying to do with it?
Yeah, so sort of two major interventions. One is that there's been a lot written in the past 15, 20 years about groovy scientists and engineers in the 60s and 70s, people who took a lot of mushrooms or were into astral projection or whatever. And that's cool work. That's fun to read, and it makes an important point.
Yes,
but I think the point also needs to be made that those people were still a pretty small minority.
Yes,
and that, most scientists and engineers remain pretty square.
Yes,
and yet they did a lot of the same things, actually, that their groovy colleagues were doing.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yep.
So that's one intervention. The other is, there's been this whole movement over the past, 15, 20 years of responsible research and innovation. So trying to find ways to encourage scientists and engineers to practice in a way that benefits us all, or practice in a way with us all. I think that's worth experimenting with. But what I was trying to show in the book is that science and engineering go through these periods where they become more responsible and less responsible. And, we need to really think about the historical context.
Yes.
And the ways that encourages people to do one and the other.
Yes. And, so how'd you get into these squares? Is it that you identified with them and you felt like my people are missing in the story? How'd you get into this?
Yeah, so certainly I do identify with them to a significant extent. And I even make a point occasionally in the book that a lot of these people were Midwesterners like myself, from very square backgrounds. There's even one chapter where I say, look, my family background is very similar to the main figure in this chapter, so I think I have a kind of autoethnographic sensibility of what was going on.
Where'd you grow up in the Midwest, Cyrus?
Lawrence, Kansas.
Okay, right on.
But yeah, that's not all. It's also that there's all this great work being written by our colleagues about these groovy scientists and engineers. And again, I respect that work. I respect those authors immensely. But I thought they needed a little bit of a nudge.
No, it's a wonderful intervention historiographically. It's just one of these things. It's very clean. You can see the contribution or so-called gap right away when you start into the book. It's like, yeah, right. I mean, and it's funny, I think that, the way our politics and aesthetic sensibilities as scholars, the way we idealize the 60s and the New Left in various ways, like, those kind of countercultural 60s scientists and, the ethical, moral, political things they get up to are very attractive to us, right? Broadly. I'm speaking of us as field, right?
Yeah, right.
So it's really good, man. And so tell us, I want to kind of ask some high-level orienting questions first. Why do you, so part of your point is that, these square folks who are not these revolutionaries, they end up becoming concerned with the same kind of things, steering away from DoD money and, and thinking about interdisciplinarity and all these things that why do you think is your point really that we can't generalize, that we have to look at, because it's a series of case studies, right? Or do you think that, or do you think there's large forces driving these squares towards these things? Or is it more we need to just look at different individual examples?
No, I think it's more about the kind of structural conditions.
Yep.
And there the intervention is more toward this responsible research and innovation field, which the interventions they want to make are really kind of at the individual level, maybe at the organizational level. What they're trying to get scientists and engineers to do is to internalize certain responsible principles, with the idea that once that's been internalized, then they're going to go out into the world and practice responsibly.
Yeah.
And in the case studies in my book, I look at these people who didn't internalize anything really. There was no one trying to train them to practice responsibly. But when certain structural conditions fell into place, they did practice more responsibly. And when those conditions fell apart, they stopped. They went back to working with the military.
Yeah.
They lost interest in solar power.
Yeah. I'm kind of a regulationist in that sense too, that I think it's as much about structures as it anything. I have similar criticisms of these strands of STS that are very focused on things like responsible innovation and teaching engineering undergrads ethics. Not that I think ethics is bad to put in education, but it's just like, I think the forces that shape these things are much bigger and structural in that way, right?
I mean, for myself, I think fine, interventions with scientists and engineers, teaching undergrads ethics, that's great.
Yeah.
But who really needs the intervention? It's all of us.
Right.
Like,
amen.
We're the ones who set the conditions that create responsible science and engineering.
Yeah, totally. And so another concept that you use here is the long 1970s. So tell us a bit about why you find that like a helpful framework for thinking about this.
Yeah. Well, people bring this up a lot as though this is somehow, I don't know, controversial or innovative. To me, it just seems kind of intuitive that, that the things started to shift pretty rapidly toward the end of the 60s.
Yep.
And they didn't really achieve a new equilibrium until sometime in the early 80s.
Yep.
And, that intervening period, it's not 1 decade, it's about a decade and a half. So why not call it the long 1970s? Nothing's that pinned on it, but I think that period, a lot of things happened during that period that kept it in this state of flux.
Yeah.
And so we have to look at that period both as a whole, but also, break open the black box and look at what was going on inside it.
Yep. And I think that, another intervention you make in at least one of the chapters that's connected to this is that we have this 60s counterculture literature, and then there's a giant literature on neoliberalism and science policy and such. But there is this kind of connective tissue missing that you're looking at here of like how things shift in the 70s, right? I mean, as an important part of telling that, kind of connecting those things.
Yeah. I mean, in almost all the case studies, maybe not all of them, but most of them, you can see moves toward a new state of affairs that in hindsight, we can see the connections to neoliberalism. We can, ex post facto, we can say, oh, that's obviously a symptom of neoliberal influence.
Right.
But at the time, the people I'm looking at, they didn't read Hayek. They weren't using that word neoliberal. They weren't really thinking about, high level economics. They were thinking about budgets for sure.
Right.
But they weren't market fundamentalists at all. They just wanted to try out some new things. They tried out a lot of new things. some of which look kind of neoliberal, but many of which don't.
Yeah.
And one of the big messages is that, looking backward, it seems like there's a neoliberal shift, but that's only because all of those other experiments that weren't terribly neoliberal, they kind of got filtered out later.
Yeah.
When neoliberals were in charge,
Right.
But at the time, that language wasn't being used at all on the ground.
Yes.
Among practicing scientists and engineers.
Yeah. And I think it's one of those cases where, like, if we're not careful with that term and we kind of import it anachronistically and aren't careful, we can lose sight of just other traditions and things going on that are driving this that aren't that set of ideas, right?
Yeah, totally.
Your book is definitely one. I don't want to kind of go through all the case studies because I want to entice readers to check it out. And, but I would like to do, a couple. And I thought, since the chapter on University of California, Santa Barbara is kind of, you do a lot of work in that chapter, actually, that sets up the rest of the book in some ways. So can you tell us a little bit like why, if you're telling a story about squares in the long 70s, why do you end up at UCSB, which seems kind of a groovy place to me, man. I don't know. So so tell us about why you chose that case.
Yeah, for sure. And you're coming up to a point that a number of the reviewers of the book have made, and it's a fair point, but I do have a response. So thanks for the opportunity. So why I write this chapter? So is kind of two reasons. One is that in my first book, Instrumental Community, which was a history of probe microscopy, a lot of the action takes place in Santa Barbara because there was a group at University of California, Santa Barbara that did a lot of very early and important work on those kinds of microscopes. And then related to them, but not so directly related to them, there was an academic startup company that became the main manufacturer of these microscopes. So I already knew quite a bit about kind of physicists in Santa Barbara. And in particular, the guy who starts the startup company, Digital Instruments, physicist named Virgil Ealings, I knew that he had been doing some, creative pedagogy in the 70s. And it always kind of bothered me that I never really sort of dug into that.
Yeah, how cool.
And then, at a certain point, I was invited to contribute a couple chapters, one for a volume that Martin Kinney and David Mowry did on innovation in the University of California system, and then one, the groovy science volume that Patrick McRae and Dave Kaiser did. And I thought, okay, this is my chance. I can pull that string and figure out what was Virgil doing in the 1970s. And so I started digging, and I noticed that he had patented a few things with a guy named David Phillips. That wasn't a name I knew at the time. But when I looked up to see if David Phillips had left any archival trace, well, his papers are in the UC Santa Barbara Library in their American Religions collection.
Uh-huh.
And so it turns out that he's a fascinating guy. He's one of the most, to me, sympathetic characters in the squares. He was a physicist. He was, actually, he and Virgil Ealings are similar in many ways. They both come from Iowa. They both, go off to kind of big name physics departments to get their PhD. They go into the military industrial complex for a while. They get hired at UC Santa Barbara to help that department, rise in the global rankings by training PhD candidates. Neither of them really ends up doing that. Ealings, because he's got other interests. Phillips has other interests too, and those are parapsychology.
Right on.
He gets very interested in Kabbalah, in paranormal phenomena, in various spiritual traditions. And so I think he's kind of says, well, I'm a physicist. what can I contribute to this? Well, I can make stuff in my garage to try and measure some of these paranormal phenomena. His son, Glenn Phillips, is frontman for Toad the Wet Sprocket.
Oh, wow.
He actually has a song about his father. In his garage, there are all these books on physics, but also all these books on parapsychology. So, yeah, to try and mash this together into a story, the intervention I wanted to make was to say, okay, yes, there was groovy stuff going on, right? Parapsychology, yeah, it's pretty groovy. But David Phillips is about as square as you can get and still be into parapsychology, right? He's a guy who wears, short sleeve button down shirts with a skinny black tie every day. He has this very earnest kind of questing attitude towards paranormal phenomena, right? He's just curious, and physics is his route into it, right?
Yeah.
But he and Ealings are trying all kinds of other things to deal with the turbulent conditions facing American physics at the time, right? Funding is crashing, student enrollments are crashing. There's protests on campus. Black students take over the computer center.
That's right.
Run by Ealings and Phillips' friend Glenn Kohler. So what can they do? Well, in their garage, they can make these funny devices and interact with this kind of esoteric community. But on campus, they start this kind of experimental master's program to train people to build innovative scientific instruments. They're working with the guy who runs the machine shop for the physics department to kind of open up the physics department to the public. So this is one of the origins of these kind of public open days that a lot of science labs, academic labs have these days, but at the time it was very strange and new. They're approaching funders who aren't the military, so rich philanthropists who might be interested in parapsychology, or they're getting their students to work with local organizations, hospitals, and so forth. They're just trying everything. And over time, a lot of that stuff kind of disappears. So this master's program eventually gets canceled. Phillips more or less loses interest in parapsychology, or at least that community kind of peters out. But
yes,
the one thing that sticks around is Ealings becomes an academic entrepreneur. A serial entrepreneur, actually, founds company after company. So the company I knew him from my first book, that's his most successful company. But it comes at the end of a long string of less successful companies, or companies that are much smaller, that he kind of, runs for a few years, and then he closes up shop and he reinvests the money into the next venture. And he didn't set out to become an entrepreneur. He certainly had no idea that the marketization of the university was the way forward, right? It was just one experiment amongst many that made sense, partly for kind of translating what his master's students were doing to publics who could make use of their ideas. But, of the various things he was doing and that Phillips was doing, it's that academic entrepreneurship that has become something
that's fascinating.
That's a commonplace today.
Yeah. Well, and other stuff too that they're playing with too, like these partnerships with local companies and stuff, which obviously has a long background in U.S. Universities, but still, I mean, they're playing with these things that, as we were saying earlier, if you look back at it with like neoliberal goggles on, you're like, oh, this is early, but it's it's like there's also parapsychology going on. I mean, they're experimenting culturally. Yeah, that's really nice, man. And so, I also want to talk about Stanford, just as like the other kind of taste to give folks. And so, here one of the key things is kind of interdisciplinarity, which is like has this kind of groovy connotation to it. But the squares were into it too. So tell us about like, now flesh out Stanford for us, and then we'll have a kind of bigger conversation.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, the motivation. Well, again, Stanford was a school that I looked at in some earlier work, so I knew a lot about the school, and I knew that they have incredible archival holdings.
I've heard this. I've not gone in, but I've heard this. And there's this great archivist there too, right? I mean, what's his name?
Henry Lowood?
Yeah. I know Henry because he writes about board games as well. Right, so I like his board game history stuff. Yep.
Yeah, so it's a great kind of test object for lots of questions in history of post-war science, American science. And in some earlier work, I'd kind of noticed that in this window of time, late 60s, early 70s, everyone at Stanford is talking about interdisciplinarity. I mean, just constantly. And of course, everyone on American campuses is talking about interdisciplinarity today, too.
Yes, they are.
Academic administrators use it as a synonym for good, right? Like, that's very interdisciplinary.
They also use it as a tool to do whatever top-down reforms they're wanting to do at the moment, at least in our case. So, yeah.
But one thing I noticed at Stanford was that actually academic administrators then were really skeptical of interdisciplinarity. They were like, well, this is a fad. We need to be cautious about it. If we go too far into this, it's really going to take us away from our core mission and, make us beholden to all of these interests so that we can't have a kind of independent, disciplined expertise anymore. So that's what historians love. That's change over time, right? Like that's the past as this alien place where interdisciplinarity meant something totally different. So I started to dig in, and what you see immediately is that in the years when the Vietnam War was at its most controversial on American campuses, and also again when funding for research was crashing and all this other stuff was going on, everyone was in favor of interdisciplinarity, but they had different reasons to be in favor of it. Right. So, the SDS campus activists, they said, well, look, interdisciplinarity is something that the military services and NASA really prize for their national security aims. So we need to use the same methods, but for the benefit of civil society. Right.
Yep.
Sort of normie liberal faculty, they said, interdisciplinarity is good because it can get the different sides of campus to communicate with each other,
two culture stuff.
Each other. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Administrators, they were cautious, but on the other hand, there was all this funding available for interdisciplinary research. So, at a certain point, they said, okay, fine, we need the money, so go for it.
Yeah.
It was kind of this. It was the one thing actually that people at Stanford in this period could agree on, and it then manifested in a number of different ways. So one is that there were actually some projects that we can say, look, people before 68, 69 were operating in a more monodisciplinary way. And then after 68, 69, we do actually see them practicing in a more interdisciplinary way. And also in the 80s, we see them going back to a more monodisciplinary form of research.
Yeah.
There's clearly other episodes where the researchers themselves are kind of doing the same thing they always had been doing for a few years before, but suddenly administrators are like, look, look at our computer music guys, look at our political scientists or the computer scientists.
Right.
To say, it's not all ivory tower and it's not all just, talking to our colleagues. We can do stuff that benefits society. One of the initiatives that comes out of that is STS itself, right? I mean, Stanford has one of the very first STS programs in the US, and it's created by this very interdisciplinary group of engineers, philosophers, religious studies people, etc. And it's the people leading that are very plugged into what's going on with the protests and the controversies on campus, and they really see STS as a way to help Stanford get through that.
Yep. Well, it's beautiful, man. And I hope it gets taken up. I mean, I think it's going to get, a lot of citations, the book, because I feel like, again, that its contribution to the literature is just immediately apparent. If you know the literature and you read the title, you're like, oh, shit, right? This is what
I'm going for. Yep.
I have a terminological question for you that I was also asking a recent guest, Raquel Velu, which is, can we talk about the term technoscience for a second? So when you use it, I think, appropriately and in a limited fashion to talk about this very high-end, high-tech stuff where science and technology are coming together and, nano and all these things, right? But I've also, something I've had to fight in my department, someone was like, well, we should say that we do technoscience. And I'm like, look, I'm an Edgertonian dude. I studied jitneys and and plastic tanks people use to carry water and gasoline around and corrugated roofs or whatever. Like, that's not technoscience, except for when it is. But you know what I mean? So how do you use a term? Do you use it in this kind of limited way, or, what is its purview for you? And, why is it important to you, or why do you use it?
So I do mostly, I think, maybe exclusively use it in the more limited fashion that you're talking about. And for me, it's mostly a matter of convenience. I don't have a huge methodological or ideological stake in the use of that term. I can see why some people don't like it. I can see why other people do like it. For me, it's just it's very convenient to have this word that refers to a set of fields that there's no other handy term for them. Right?
Amen.
So,
yep.
I mean, the title of the square, the subtitle anyway, talks about the physical and engineering sciences.
That's right.
Right. So it's these, these areas of research that they have some kind of technological horizon or some kind of applied horizon, but they're not necessarily always at that horizon. But they can never entirely escape.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And it's
especially for funders.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a set of fields that are, they're not usually in the same college of a university, right? So they're in the engineering school, but they're also in faculties of arts and sciences.
Yeah.
So there's just no other handy term for them.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
And I think, I feel like this is one of those literatures that's kind of fallen out of, we don't talk about it very much anymore, but I still think it's important, which is the old science technology relationship literature going back at least to the 70s with folks like Edwin Layton and folks like that. But, I think there's that, some of my mentors, there was also that important story, like with Steve Usselman's book about how the railroads start using scientists to do material stuff for them, metallurgy especially. Yeah. And then Hounshell
principle is from the railroads.
Yeah. And, and then, forward through kind of Hounshell's R&D work, which I think you've very often write broadly in this literature of research labs. And it really is about thinking about where do science and technology come together at these kind of bleeding edges. So I don't know, maybe I'll do a post, an old, the science technology relationship, a newsletter post or something, because I think it's important, but maybe not talked about enough.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Ron Klein student, so
that makes sense.
He introduced me to that literature very early on.
That's fascinating. Oh yeah. So who else was on your committee? Was he your advisor?
He was my advisor when I got to Cornell. And then he went on sabbatical or something at kind of a transition
an awkward
stage.
point. Yeah.
And so partly as a matter of convenience, Mike Lynch ended up officially being my advisor.
He's a historian of science, right?
No, he's an ethnomethodologist.
Oh, this guy. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I read his ethnomethodology stuff, but okay. So he was your advisor?
Yeah, technically, but I worked pretty equally with Ron and Mike, and then also Trevor Pinch.
Okay, right on. Fascinating committee. So I wanted to kind of go from the squares to thinking about your career and the kind of the path from your first book, Instrumental Community, through your Moore's Law book to the squares. And I had to say, you're like famous for being one of these kind of annoyingly productive people there for a while. Especially you were really cranking and
not so much anymore. But
well, you're a dad, and like things slow down at some point. But you were really flying there for a while. But one of the things I was thinking about, so you kind of mentioned your dissertation and first book, which is on this microscopy. And then you go from that to Moore's Law to the squares. And something I see in you, Cyrus, I mean, you are often looking at physicists and these, engineering scientists, or however we want to think about them, is that there's this kind of empiricist side to you, I think, where it's like you studied the microscopy community, right? Did this really deep study of that group. And then, I mean, what led you to Moore's Law then?
Yeah. Again, it was because I could see a pretty clear intervention.
Exactly. Okay.
So the first book on probe microscopes, so when I got to grad school, I thought I was going to mostly be doing lab studies, so laboratory ethnography.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I did actually, I did that for a while, and I wrote some interesting things, and that to some extent is still kind of hovering in the background of that first book. But I got interested in how those microscopes got into labs like the ones that I was in. And that's a more historical question.
Yeah.
Pretty recent history at that point. So that first book is the most of the evidentiary basis from oral history interviews.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people I was interviewing, this is in 2001, 2000 to 2002, roughly. They were kind of relabeling themselves as nanoscientists.
You did. I think it's you and Youngsub have that paper on material sciences and how it got rebranded as nanotech, right?
Yeah.
Am I remember that? Exactly. I love that paper. Yeah. It's been a while since I read it, but that is one of my favorites about rebranding. Cool. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Always great to work with Youngsub.
Yeah.
So the actors I was studying were making this shift towards nano.
Yes.
And then I got an email, I think it was from Davis Baird, but it might have been from Ann Johnson. Anyway, someone from South Carolina saying, we're going to be at the same conference coming up. Can we meet? So I met with Davis and Ann, and Davis had all these big ideas about, we're going to do social studies of nano at South Carolina. And, do you want to be part of this? So, sure. I mean, I hadn't really thought of my dissertation as being about nano, but you could easily see it that way.
Yep.
And certainly, these microscopes were important in nano.
Yep.
The people I was studying, they were seeing nano as a way to go. So I got pulled into that social studies of nano community. First, the South Carolina crowd, which was super fun. I mean, it was very freewheeling.
Yeah.
And they had some great people. And Chris Toomey.
I miss Ann very much. She was so great.
For sure. But then that community, it grew. It got a little more professional, a little more institutionalized on both sides of the Atlantic. In the U.S., mainly through these two centers for nanotechnology and society that the NSF funded for what ended up being 11 years. So one at Arizona State, and then Patrick McRae asked me to be involved in the one at UC Santa Barbara. So, I got to see that community grow. I got to see it kind of plug into larger nano community, begin to institutionalize through the National Nanotechnology Initiative and through all these, centers mushrooming everywhere.
Yes.
And I, from, as you say, this kind of pretty fine-grained empirical base that I came to nano with, I was always bugged that there were a lot of issues that weren't being talked about in this community, right? So people wanted to talk a lot about visions. They wanted to talk a lot about anticipatory governance, scenarios. They wanted to talk about, gray goo, and nanobots, and
how nanotechnology was going to drive inequality and shit like this.
Yeah. So all the things that could happen with nano, and it was obvious to me that there was already a lot of nano out there. So why weren't we talking about the nano that actually exists?
Amen.
And instead, why are we focusing on all this nano that doesn't exist and might never exist? And in particular, the most substantial actually existing nano industry is pretty clearly the microelectronics industry.
Yes.
Semiconductor industry, whatever you want to call it. So I already had some knowledge of that industry from the probe microscopy book, because these microscopes are used, they were invented at IBM, and when it was a big semiconductor manufacturer, they're used on the chip manufacturing line mostly for quality control. And I had ideas for a few more case studies that would be centered on that industry. So that second book is really a kind of a nudge to that social studies of nanotechnology community to talk about this actually existing nano.
That's great, man. And what I appreciate about your work, Cyrus, is that it kind of builds forward from empirical work you've done, right? I mean, when we were talking about the squares earlier, UCSB is your first case study, but then you see like a new historiographical problem or, a new gap that you can go back to these things that you have very deep knowledge of and then move it forward further. Like you gave that example of the squares earlier where, you knew this guy was up to creative pedagogy, but you hadn't had a chance to look into it yet. But you already had deep knowledge about this guy. And I just think this is kind of one of my obsessive soapboxes right now is I'm writing an essay about methods in technology studies, which is really about empiricist approaches to technology studies, And I just have always really appreciated that aspect of your work, how you kind of think forward from things. And I want to tie that to two of your current projects in a second, because I think you're continuing to do just that. But I wanted to ask you, just kind of get on, on the record about Moore's Law for a second, because I just wanted to, it's just one of these like perennially fascinating things in technology studies circles, but also in broader culture. It gets evoked in so many kind of like incorrect ways to represent technology in general and shit like that, But like where, there's several different ways to define Moore's Law, and this is something you talk about in your book.
Yeah.
But given
it's part of the secret sauce.
Yeah, exactly.
All these different things.
Yeah. I mean, but if you were going to like have like what you see as a realistic definition or meaningful definition or two, where do you think it's at these days? I mean, for a lot of people that I take seriously say it's been over for, 5 to 10 years or something like that. And, we need new paradigm shifts or whatever the hell people are going to talk about, right? But where do you wrote a whole book about this. Where do you think Moore's Law is at these days?
Yeah. So I think whatever Moore's Law was,
yes,
it had something to do with the shrinking size of the components in microelectronic circuits. and the complexity of those circuits that can be packaged into a commercial chip that we can all buy, right?
Yeah.
So it's costs nothing to make one of these.
Yep.
And put a billion transistors on it. That version of Moore's law says that our ability to cram more and more stuff more and more cheaply onto the same amount of silicon real estate every year, I think is not dead, but is not as alive as it once was.
Okay, that's fair.
I mean, it had a kind of golden age where it was like clockwork, and things were you knew exactly how small components were going to be 2 years from now, 10 years from now.
Yeah, you wrote a really nice paper on bat signals related to this, as you called it. Yep.
And nowadays, I don't think that's the case. Or if people do know the size of things somewhere down the next few years of road, it's not miniaturizing nearly as quickly as it once was. Still advances, still stuff to be squeezed out of that turnip, but it's not what it was. Now, whether that means that they'll have to completely redefine Moore's law so that it refers to advances in
power
along
or
some
whatever.
other metric.
Yeah.
Something like that will probably happen. But I don't think anyone quite knows.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. It's certainly not standardized yet. What that thing would be? Yes.
No.
Yeah, that's nice. And I mean, I think that what I've heard some smart people say about this is that if Moore's law is about cost, then probably if it's not just about miniaturization, but it's also about cost and driving down costs, then probably it's over in the sense that we can make things smaller, but it's expensive. And in most cases, we're going to apply like cell phones. You held up a cell phone earlier and said like this. I mean, most applications in the world just aren't going to end up using chips like that, right? So if it's about not just like, making things smaller, but like mass producing those small things and putting them in everything, then that's probably, not where things are at right now. Well, go ahead.
It could take up some totally other dimension, right?
Totally.
Like it could be, using less power, or
I mean, that would be great.
The process itself could become greener, right? Like, There's still room for improvement, for sure.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. And yes, the power thing would be very nice. And maybe that's a beautiful segue to one of your projects, managing scarcity and sustainability, the oil industry, environmentalism, and alternative energy in the age of scarcity. So why don't you just tell people a bit about this project, which, I mean, has the potential to take over your life until you die, I think, because it's potentially so big. But tell the people about the thing.
Yeah, so the origins of this project were when I was at Rice University in Houston. So, oil is everywhere. My department, the history department, owned a natural gas well.
Okay.
It's really hard to escape in Houston.
Amazing.
and there was this fantastic group of oil historians down the road at University of Houston that I would go see once a month or so.
Yeah, those guys are great.
So, and then at Rice, Dominic Boyers, anyhow, a few others, mostly coming out of anthropology, were putting together what the acronym was CENHS, but it stood for Center for Energy and Environmental Research in the Human Sciences.
Oh, very nice. Yeah.
So basically an energy humanities center.
Yeah.
And I got kind of sucked into that. So I had oil, I had energy on my brain. I was writing the Moore's Law book. So I was reading a lot of stuff about Silicon Valley and, other high-tech industries, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I kept noticing oil come up over and over and over again, especially in histories of biotechnology. There's all these great books about early biotech companies, and they all have this paragraph where they're like, oh yeah, and this company was floated by, these oil companies in its early years, and that's never really commented on.
Yeah.
And it's definitely never commented on that this is true of all of the most important early biotech companies.
Fascinating.
So I started to toy with the idea of making that my next project. It was originally kind of a sort of innovation studies oriented project.
Right.
Let's look at where oil flows into all these non-oil high-tech areas. Then in the middle of that, I moved to the Netherlands, which ended up being great for this project. I mean, great in many ways, but great for this project because here it's possible to get funding to do real team research.
Yes. It's important. Yep.
Yeah. So I have this grant, Managing Scarcity, which supports myself and a postdoc, Odin Melstead, and 2 PhD candidates, Jelena Stankovic and Michiel Bron.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah.
And when I put it together, I sort of said, yeah, okay, we're all going to kind of look at some non-oil area where oil has been really important. So Yellen is looking at oil and solar, Michiel's looking at oil and nuclear, Odin, oil and geothermal.
Nice.
I'm doing these non-energy things, biotech, artificial intelligence, computing, nano again.
Cool.
But as we dove into it, like you say, it could take over my life because I've realized recently, but this was coming for a while, that actually it's 2 projects.
Okay.
So one is looking at kind of the business and technological dimensions of how oil companies made it through the oil crises of the 70s.
Right.
And one thing they were doing was they were experimenting with all of these other.
They were diversifying as a possible path. Yeah.
Which they mostly gave up in the 80s.
Right.
And that's
exactly.
That's the big thing we want to explain in the book. Why did they do it in the first place? But
yes.
Also, why did they get out of it?
Yeah.
But then in parallel with that, there were some big hitters in the oil industry.
Yeah.
So definitely not every company or every executive, but some prominent figures who got interested in not just the business and the technology side, but also they made some kind of bridge to the environmental movement, and they got involved in diplomacy, and they really contributed to some of the institutions of global environmental governance that are still with us today.
Oh, fascinating!
So,
yeah.
UN Environment Program first director Maurice Strong was an oil guy. These are the people who kind of helped enshrine sustainable development as a core principle of environmental governance.
Okay. Wow, man, it's so great. And who was I talking with? I was talking to Dana Boyd recently. That episode's not even out yet. And she was talking about a book she produced with a research team. And I was like, I think Europe's better at this, though sometimes it gets kind of hung up in anticipatory governance land or whatever, instead of like research project empiricist land. But, there's just things that teams can do. I learned this through Pierre Bourdieu's work, actually. Like some of those some of his most important books, it was entire armies of folks he had doing, stuff. And so I just think these big topics like this oil thing, oil ends up everywhere. And how are you going to write about that other than to have a team? It is impossible.
Yeah. I mean, a great example is the PhD candidate, Michiel, who's working on oil and nuclear. I mean, when I designed that bit of the proposal, I thought, well, isn't it interesting? There are all these oil companies who get into nuclear power in the late 60s. So let's have a PhD candidate look at that.
Yeah.
And he's taken it and he's run with it, and he can draw that story back to the 1920s now.
Oh, exactly. Oh, that's so good. Yes.
There's so much more going on with that story that I could never have gotten to myself.
Oh, that's beautiful. I think that the nano group around Patrick that included you and Young Sub, it was much more informal. It wasn't a planned thing, but it ended up doing something like that. And that's why I think, I'm well known for beating up on the anticipatory governance kind of ASU model of the nano stuff. But I really think that group around with Anne and Patrick and you and Young Sub, I think that stuff came out of there that holds up. And I think it's going to continue to be cited for, generations of people moving forward if they want to talk about rebranding or material science or whatever. I mean, they will go back to that work. And so, I think the same thing is going to be true of this oil project. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about, so I kind of forgot that you were all tied up in the nanobubbles project.
Yeah.
And I haven't had a chance to hang out with these characters yet, but there's one of your colleagues, his name is Max Rossmann, is it? Or
Rossmann, yeah.
Rossmann. And then there's Freddie Bourguignon and Marianne Noel, and there's these other folks that I haven't had a chance to hang out with yet, but is destined to happen because I'm really into the kind of hype studies going on. And so, tell people about nanobubbles and what it is first, I think, and then maybe you can say a bit about what you're up to with it.
Yeah, okay. So my involvement with nanobubbles actually is an outgrowth of Patrick's group at Center for Nano and Society. Patrick had a blog on
leaping robots.
Yeah, exactly. And he asked me to do a guest post looking at this controversy about what were called stripy nanoparticles. Mm-hmm. So these are nanoparticles that supposedly you can put other molecules on the outside of the particle and they'll make stripes.
Mm-hmm.
Another nanoscientist, Raphael Levy, had looked at these things. He looked at the atomic force microscope images of these particles and said, yeah, this is an imaging artifact. There's no actual stripes there. And so it was a big controversy. And Patrick asked me to look at it through the lens of, through an historical lens, particularly the history of probe microscopy and the debates about artifacts with those microscopes. So I wrote a guest post about that. And Raphael read it, and I guess liked it. Because then a number of years later, he contacted me out of the blue and he said, look, I like that post you wrote. I've gotten involved in other controversies since then. And I want to put together a project to look at these kinds of controversies.
Okay, right.
So
did you hold like a workshop or something on controversies? Okay.
Well,
some kind of something? Yeah, okay.
He pulled together... maybe 15 of us, something like that.
Okay.
For a small meeting at the French Embassy in London.
Okay. I kind of, now this is making sense. I remember when that happened. Yeah.
He co-organized it with Marianne Noel, who you mentioned, who is originally a chemist.
Okay.
And she became a science diplomat. So she worked at the French Embassy in South Korea during the whole Huang scandal about cloning. And, so after that meeting, Raphael said, there's definitely enough interesting stuff going on here. Let's do it. So we pulled together a group to apply for a European Research Council Synergy grant. Mm-hmm. Thinking we wouldn't get it on the first try, but it was nice to bring the group together and get some ideas on paper. But then we ended up, we did get it on the first try.
So much for that.
Yeah. Now we have this very cool, highly interdisciplinary project.
Cool.
With, there's 4 co-PIs, Raphael, nanoscientist, me, and Willem Halfman, representing STS. And Cyril Mody is a computer scientist. And then we also have library scientists like Frédéric Bourguignon, you mentioned, philosophers, YJ and Federico Boehm, innovation studies, technology assessment people like Max Rossmann.
Yeah.
And we're spread over a bunch of sites in the Netherlands and France, about 25 people total.
It's so cool.
And our tagline is, we try to understand how, when, and why scientists fail to correct the scientific record.
Okay, and so I was about to ask you about that. That was my next question. Is like it says the project focuses on how, when, and why science fails to correct itself. So you're looking at nanobubbles. There's hype involved, but why is that failure to correct itself like a good frame for working through the issue?
Well, so it's partly from Raphael's personal experience of having tried to get the scientific record corrected several times now on 3 or 4 different controversies, and either failing completely or finding it much, much, much more difficult than he expected it to be. So there's all of these institutions and incentives that are arrayed to really discourage it, right? Journals hate to correct stuff.
Yeah.
Universities hate it when someone tries to get one of their staff members' articles retracted.
Yes.
Conferences are often kind of organized in a way where if you ask probing questions, people take offense. And
they get real defensive. Yeah.
So it's just much more difficult than it should be for us to kind of honestly talk through what's going on and correct things if it's needed.
Yeah. Well, and I also think that there's, this is one of those great tragedies in research life. But I bumped into Twitter like 3 or 4 years ago now, a recent-ish article that was saying, that was making the argument that's kind of obvious when you think about it, is that the way we structure our funding programs, it encourages hyperbole and even outright lies about what our research is going to deliver, right? So there's plenty of obvious structures around encouraging overclaiming and such. And then, and then that goes hand in hand with this kind of defensive-ness and the other things that you mentioned. It's a really fascinating social scientific issue, actually, And I also think, I'm kind of recently, for the last couple of years, I've been kind of in this kind of like hype critique mode that came out of like maintainer stuff and kind of like thinking about the lack of technological change, even though, there's a lot of hype out there. And, some people I think have accused me of I think my point is some people think I'm not also recognizing that hype and imaginaries and stuff guide action, which is is part of your bat signal stuff with chips and stuff, is that hype plays a sociological role in guiding investment and all these kinds of things, right? I think that's true, and I think we should study that too, and I think there's good people doing it, like Neil Pollack and Devin Powers and other kinds of characters, but it doesn't kind of get us away from this rub that your colleague is focusing on here of how I'm sorry, I forgot his name.
Max Pro.
Raphael.
Raphael.
Yeah. I mean, this rub that but there's not a lack of correction there. That's a problem, actually, right? Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and there's also, think about the flip side, right? There's all kinds of work that's presented more modestly, more plausibly, more true to the empirical base, and it gets ignored.
Amen, man. Amen. Well, Cyrus, usually the last question I ask people is what they're doing next, but I think that the rest of your life is mapped out, so we don't really have to talk about it.
Certainly in the next few years.
Yeah, but I also think listeners will see that whatever it is you get up to next, it is going to build forward from what you've already done. I think that's really, how you work, and I think it's a strong way of working, so hats off to you, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to talk to me today, Cyrus. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Lee. That means a lot. I really enjoyed it too.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.